In the last lesson, we examined the first two steps in the general strategy for tackling reading comprehension questions. In this lesson, we'll examine the third step, which is to fully engage in the passage. One of the primary purposes of this step is to avoid what I call the Sunday morning newspaper syndrome. This is a fascinating phenomenon where your eyes pass over words in an article, but your mind thinks about other things. Things like the chores you should do later in the day or what to have for lunch. What happens is that after reading several paragraphs without engaging, you realize that nothing you read has registered, and you have to reread the article. Now, all of this is fine if you're spending a relaxing morning reading the newspaper, but on test day, it's not okay to let your mind wander. So what are some ways to engage deeply in the passage and thus increase your comprehension? Well, the first tip is to feign enthusiasm. Let's face it, the subject matter in reading comprehension passages can be somewhat boring. So a very natural response to a passage about Turkish income tax policy might be to roll your eyes and try not to fall asleep. Of course, this lack of attention will ultimately hurt your GRE score. So instead, your reaction should be something like, "Hey, Turkish income tax policy! Wonderful! I've always wanted to know about income tax policy in Turkey." Now this strategy may sound hokey, but it's an excellent way to become immersed in the passage. Another tip to help you engage in the material is to visualize the information in the passage. So if you're reading a passage about the nesting habitats of penguins in Antarctica, picture yourself in Antarctica, watching the scene unfold before you. Another way to stay engaged is to pay close attention to the first and last sentence of each paragraph. This is where you find a lot of very important information. In fact, some reading comprehension strategies out there recommend that you only read the first and last sentences of each paragraph. While I don't recommend this strategy, it's a good indication of the high density of important information to be found in the first and last sentences of each paragraph. The next tip is to pay close attention to transition words, such as however, furthermore, in addition, and so on. These words are like road signs that help you understand the direction of the author's next thought. Given the importance of transition words, you might want to familiarize yourself with some examples of popular transition words. In addition to using transition words to help you understand the direction of a passage, you can use these words to help you predict or foreshadow the author's next idea. By trying to predict the author's next idea, you will engage more deeply in the passage, and you will gain a deeper understanding of the structure of the passage. There are more tips to consider when it comes to engaging in the material, but before we look at them, let's examine how the tips shown so far can help us read a reading comprehension passage well. Here we have the first paragraph of a science passage, which begins with, "All of the cells in a particular plant start out with the same complement of genes. How then can these cells differentiate and form structures as different as roots, stems, leaves, and fruits?" At this point, I've paid extra attention to the first sentence. I'm picturing plants in my mind, and I'm excited to learn how plant cells can change into so many different structures. Reading on, we have, "The answer is that only a small subset of the genes in a particular kind of cell are expressed or turned on at a given time." Very interesting. The differences are caused when a subset of genes are turned on. So now I'm visualizing the genes as light switches, where some are turned on and some are not. I'm also actively trying to predict the next idea. Since this sentence tells us that some genes are turned on, perhaps the next sentence will explain which genes are turned on, or explain how the genes are turned on. Let's continue. This is accomplished by a complex system of chemical messengers that in plants include hormones and other regulatory molecules. Wow! The genes are turned on and off by chemical messengers called hormones and regulatory molecules. At this point, I'm fully engaged in the material, and I have a rich picture in my mind. Okay, now let's stop right here and examine some more tips. Another way to engage with the material is to look for information that might help us answer tone questions that ask us to determine how an author feels about information in the passage. One way to do this is to watch out for non-neutral words. These are words that have either positive or negative connotations. For example, consider this portion of a passage about American import laws. By using words such as brazen and bizarre, the author is sending a clear message about he or she feels about these incidents. Similarly, the phrase crying for help is meant to show the author's contempt for the way in which a certain company behaved. Instead of saying crying for help, the author could have said something neutral like asking for help or requesting help. Instead, the words crying for help provide us with a solid clue regarding the author's position on the matter. So look for non-neutral words to help you answer any tone questions that may accompany the passage. Now up to this point, we've examined tips to help you fully engage in the passage, and this is important. However, there are times when it's best to let certain information pass by without much attention at all. Remember that on GRE reading comprehension questions, the specific details of a passage are much less important than the main idea and the structural framework of the passage. As such, we must be careful not to get caught up in the details. This means that you should not attempt to memorize dates, names, and scientific details. Just note the location of the information so that you can return to it later if you're given a details question related to that information. On a similar note, don't get bogged down with technical language unless the passage is placing a lot of emphasis on it. To see these strategies in action, let's return to our passage about genes and plant differentiation. The next sentence begins with 5 major hormones have been identified, and these hormones are as follows. At this point, we're not going to try and memorize these names. In fact, we can just skim over the names and keep a mental note that the 5 hormones are listed at the bottom of the first paragraph. This brings us to the last sentence of the first paragraph, where we're told that studies of plants have now identified a new class of regulatory molecules called oligosaccharides. Remember that we want to pay extra attention to the first and last sentence of each paragraph. So we'll make a point of noting that studies have identified a new class of regulatory molecules. These molecules happen to have a complex name, and we certainly don't want to memorize this word, but since it appears in the last sentence of the paragraph, it's quite possible that the word will have significance later on. These molecules happen to have a complex name, and we certainly don't want to memorize this word during the exam, but since it appears in the last sentence of the paragraph, it's quite possible that the word will have significance later on. So rather than ignore the word altogether, let's simply refer to oligosaccharides as olis. Okay, let's keep reading the passage. Here we'll pay extra attention to the first sentence of this paragraph. It reads, unlike the olis. Oh, I'll stop right here and note that the sentence begins with the transition word unlike, which is meant to show contrast. So the part that follows this phrase will be different from the oligosaccharides. The next part reads, the 5 well-known plant hormones are pleiotropic rather than specific. We have this confusing word pleiotropic here, and I have no idea what it means. So should I ignore it, or should I try and determine what it means? Well, the word happens to appear in the first sentence of this paragraph, so it's probably important. As such, I'm going to try and find the meaning of this word. The next part reads, that is, each has more than one effect on the growth and development of plants. Great! Pleiotropic means having more than one effect. So the all-important first sentence is telling us that the hormones have more than one effect on plants, and the olis have just one effect. Now let's continue. The 5 have so many simultaneous effects that they're not very useful in artificially controlling the growth of crops. Okay, here we have a reiteration of the fact that the hormones have many effects and that this makes them not so great with crops. The next sentence begins with oxen, for instance. Okay, I'm going to stop at the transition phrase, for instance. We should be able to predict what's going to follow. The sentence before this told us that the 5 hormones have many effects on plants, so the next sentence is going to provide an example of a situation where a hormone has many effects on plants. Is this important information? Not really. The important part was the fact that each of the 5 hormones has many effects on plants. So if we understand that, then the example is kind of irrelevant. Sure, we might read the example, but I'm not going to devote much attention to fully understanding exactly what's happening here. We're told that auxin stimulates the rate of cell elongation, causes shoots to grow up and roots to grow down, and inhibits the growth of lateral shoots. In other words, this hormone has many effects on plants, which we already knew. Now the next sentence has another transition word at the beginning. It says, auxin also. Here, we can predict that the author plans to add yet another example of how auxin has many effects on plants. Since we already know the important message about hormones having many effects on plants, we'll skim the sentence, but we're certainly not going to get bogged down in the details. The sentence reads, auxin also causes the plant to develop a vascular system to form lateral roots and to produce ethylene. As you can see, if we use transition words to predict the author's next idea, we can determine which information to fully engage in and which information can be skipped. Okay, let's stop here and review. In this lesson, we examined several ways to engage in most of the material in the passage, and we examined ways to devote less attention to some parts. Now there's one last tip to help you engage in the passage, and that tip is to actively collect information in the passage. What information? Well, this brings us to the next 2 steps in the general strategy, which we'll examine in the next 2 lessons.